This is Fresh Air. I'm Dave Davies in for Terry Gross. Decades before there was Google or Facebook, a Madison Avenue advertising man started a company based on the then revolutionary idea that if you fed enough data into a massive computer, you could predict how people will behave. Our guest today, Jill Lepore, has a story about a company formed at the end of the 1950s that had a plan to accumulate data about people's habits and preferences and use it to predict how they'll vote or shop. While the practice is a fact of life today, 70 years ago the idea was revolutionary and controversial. The company, called Simulmatics, a combination of the words simulation and automation, told clients it had crafted a people machine to predict human behavior. The idea attracted customers but drew condemnation from scholars and political leaders who saw it as a threat to democracy. Tell us about this guy, Ed Greenfield.
Yeah, I love Ed Greenfield. He had a company called Ed Greenfield & Co. At a time when Madison Avenue was growing.
So Ed Greenfield came on the scene at a time when political advertising was a new thing. People just had televisions, and candidates were getting used to the idea of ad companies. And computers were new, these big, hulking machines. What was the idea of this company that he put together that was so unique?
So he wanted to devise what he called sometimes a voting behavior machine, that you could take what we know about voters, which is information gathered by pollsters, and the information that is the giant data set that is election returns, and marry that to behavioral science, and then run it all through a computer, and you could predict how people would behave mathematically.
Right. And to do this, I mean, he was a guy who was really good at developing relationships. He knew everybody. He really tapped a lot of very sophisticated social scientists of his day, didn't he?
Yeah, because he understood that there was this great new thing going on, which was simulation, computer simulation.
This Madison Avenue ad man, Ed Greenfield, has this idea of using computers to help predict behavior. And he hooks up with a guy named Bill McPhee, who's kind of a math genius, a really interesting and colorful character.
And Minnow says to Schlesinger, remember Ed Greenfield? He worked on the campaign in '56, because Greenfield had worked for the Stevenson campaign. He'd worked for Greenfield on the Stevenson campaign in '56. And had been asked to join this new endeavor.
So in 1960, John F. Kennedy is running for president against Richard Nixon. And Ed Greenfield, who started this company, Simulmatics, convinces the Kennedy campaign to hire the company to do some research, give them some advice.
There's a lot of kind of spin around whether Kennedy had in fact been elected by a computer.
Right. But this idea that he had a secret weapon, which was a robot, it also provoked serious debate among people who were concerned about the future of democracy, right?
Yeah, it does. And I think the argument that wins out eventually, honestly, is the argument that's put forward by Jill Lepore, who's the MIT political scientist, who's the chairman of the research board for this new company, Simulmatics. He says, you want a political candidate to have as much information as possible. This is information that our technology and scientific research is now able to provide to political campaigns. So who wants to stand in the way of knowledge? Most of the coding was done by women. Women were called computers before the machines came to be called computers. It's women who've been working as typists in these corporations, and then they're brought in to learn how to work with these new machines, which, look like that's what they need. But the intellectual ambition of a lot of these women is to learn how to code, and to learn how to code as an intellectual project. They get pushed out of that work, and then over the course of the 1960s, when the kind of buzzy word is computer man, who's a computer man? And so the field becomes really masculinized once its status rises and once there are enough computers. But for a long time, the coders, the computers, were women.
All right, so on the strength of all of the attention that it got in the 1960 election, Simulmatics is a hot commodity, and Ed Greenfield sees a world of new clients he can pitch.
Yeah, it's kind of a splashy initial offering. The clientele that they reach out to, some of which they succeed in bringing in, first, advertising agencies and, big retailers, Colgate-Palmolive, Ralston, Purina, those kinds of people. They do kind of brand switching ad campaigns for them. They have to say, we have this imaginary population of consumers. We have some consumer data that, we've gotten from you or we get from ad agencies. And we can predict, who's going to switch to your dog food if you say your dog food tastes good versus who's going to switch to your dog food if you say your dog food makes your dog more energetic. And they do, just very kind of standard fare today. There's something, that I think really prefigures the arrogance of Silicon Valley, right? Where these guys, sort of the Zuckerberg kind of guy, stands above us all and tries to figure out, how women and people of color think and how they can be influenced. The irony of Simulmatics trying to figure out what message the Kennedy campaign should send about civil rights in 1960 when, Black men are sitting in at lunch counters all across the South. Black men and women are demonstrating on the streets. Do we need to write a computer program to predict what the effect would be of taking a stronger position on civil rights for Black voters? I mean, it's kind of nuts, but it's also very much the world that we now live in.
By 1964, the company was struggling, and so they find a great new client, the Defense Department of the United States, then getting more and more involved in Vietnam. What did the government think that Simulmatics could do for them in Vietnam?
Well, Ithiel de Solapool, who was in charge of the Saigon office that Simulmatics opens, had long been involved in the Department of Defense. He was a very determined Cold Warrior, and he shared a lot of the worldview of Robert McNamara, who had come, of course, from Ford Motor Company as a systems analyst and who really believed in, running the numbers and running the war by computer.
He was the defense secretary for Kennedy and then Johnson, right?
Yes. And one of the things that Simulmatics was brought in to do early on was evaluate a computer system that was trying to determine the success of and the continued loyalty of Vietnamese people living in confined rural areas. This program that was known as the Strategic Hamlet program. The Department of Defense had computers in Saigon that were running the numbers every day of kind of everything you could possibly think of, every possible indicator of what was going on in these hamlets.
And so it was a pretty radical way of trying to withdraw the popular base of the Viet Cong. Right. And it was really striking that in doing these public opinion surveys of Vietnamese peasants that they would come out in military convoys and then kind of expect people to give them honest answers to long lists of questions. What kind of information were they getting from these interviews?
Yeah, so, I spoke to some people who did the interviews, some of the social scientists, but I also spoke to some of the Vietnamese interpreters who, really did the interviews. And the Vietnamese interpreters said, it was ridiculous. Everybody thinks you're a spy. Everyone is pretty sure these people are just the CIA posing as academics. And who's to dispute them? And then I'm not going to, I'm not going to try to convince them to tell me the truth because I know that they're vulnerable. The person I'm interviewing is sitting next to somebody, who might rat them out and kill their children in response to how they answer the questions. There's just nothing about the set of circumstances that would induce an honest answer. Also, the questions are largely, bafflingly irrelevant to these people's lives and the kind of daily suffering that they're enduring during this war. The whole thing is just kind of a travesty. And what surprised me a bit was how clearly the Defense Department understood that it was a travesty and yet continued to fund it.
It's interesting that the time when Simulmatics was involved in Vietnam was a time when its work, I gather, was kind of collapsing in the United States, and Ed Greenfield was trying to figure out ways to revive the company. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, I think it's a weirdness of business history that we kind of have a kind of corporation center notion of what is happening in a company at any given time. But it's really clear that this company, which is founded on a commitment to the idea that people who aren't white men are mysterious and need to be decoded by computers, kind of can't really endure the absurdity of that idea. It kind of collapses in on itself. The 1960s are a great era of emancipation for just the kind of white women who are married to this kind of guy. They're women that gave up their education to raise children. They get caught up in the women's liberation movement. One of the reasons that it vanished is Ed Greenfield's own dissolution. I had an assignment from the New Yorker to write kind of an assessment of the state of the public opinion, the polling industry. And I wrote a piece called Politics in the New Machine. And it struck me at the time, really early in my research, that polling certainly should be, I guess, obsolete in that, with the advent of data analytics companies, data science, modern political data science, you don't have to call somebody up and ask them, 100 questions to know how they might vote or what they believe about, Biden's latest speech or Trump's latest action, because you can find out. You can collect data about them. That's how politics actually works. So I was interested for the purpose of the piece, in answering, when did that begin? And that took me to Simulmatics and the 1960 election work.
The stuff that they did that was so controversial, the idea that you could assemble data and predict how people would react to a political idea or a new product, which was controversial then, is just so completely normal now. And people are collecting, untold amounts of data from us in so many ways, Google and Facebook and hundreds of others. What's the place of Simulmatics in the story of data and its use in the country?
I was just reading this quite chilling piece by Sue Halpern in the New Yorker this week about an app that the Trump campaign has been using and how effective it is at drawing your contacts information and then also geolocating information in order to send you particular messages, and not only to you, but also to everybody in your contacts list, and have gathered information about each of them by cell phone number, which is kind of the gold standard in doing voter research, right? Because you can then, if you know your cell phone number, you know kind of everything. And I was really struck reading that we have nothing that stops this app from going into your contact list and gathering all this information, not only about you, but about everybody else that you know, and then submitting messages to them in your name. How we got to this place is because no one said no to Simulmatics, right? Black voters matter really was Ed Greenfield's message. We're going to show you that mathematically. We're going to build a computer. We're going to build a people machine that can show you that black voters matter because we need to be stronger on civil rights. It starts with this really noble commitment to civil rights. But what it produces is the world that we have today, where we're all so segmented and micro-messaged to that we have no sense of a common good any longer, and which is how, a democracy has to work. We actually are not supposed to be going into a voting booth and voting or sealing a ballot and sticking in an envelope and voting the way our demographic micro-segment says we must. Because we're actually supposed to be looking at that ballot and thinking about what's good for everyone. That notion of the public good and the public interest, which is the ground on which a democracy stands, is falling away from beneath our feet.
Right. And I guess if those of us who cover elections spend all of our time talking about just the hard politics of it, how demographics will work, that's time we could be spending talking about what's good for the country.
Yeah. Instead of just reporting the latest national poll, which doesn't really tell us anything since we live in an electoral college system anyway, I think there are deeper moral and ethical questions that, good reporters are always wrestling with. It was a real pleasure.
Jill Lepore is a professor of American history at Harvard and a staff writer for The New Yorker. Her book is If Then: How the Simulmatics Corporation Invented the Future. This is Fresh Air.